OK, so now we're going to start doing some work together. How many people have actually the Phonegap CLI installed on their machines? And now I really need you to answer, because if you don't, we're going to have to do some work. Yes? 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 No? 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 OK.
Do you have Node installed? Yeah.
Great. So if you have Node installed, npm install -g Phonegap. OK? Anybody doesn't have Node installed? Great. You good? You have the CLI? OK? All right, cool. Very nice.
It should only take a minute.
Yeah. So yeah, that's depending on the network, it should be really fast. So basically what you just did, you installed the CLI globally, so it should be available in terminal for you. Or
I was going to say, you could install Cordova too.
Yeah. So I will speak about that. We'll start with the Phonegap CLI. How many people are actually using the Cordova CLI as opposed to the Phonegap CLI? Who uses Cordova? OK. So after we go through this, I'm going to go through a little bit of history and explain the difference between the Phonegap CLI and the Cordova CLI, because that can be interesting and important. All right. So for the workshop, we're going to do this. And at this point, I'm just, in fact, I'm just going to do this and open a terminal window. So what I'd like you to do is to essentially open a terminal window and go into a directory where you feel comfortable creating projects. Maybe you have a folder already on your system where you create projects, Phonegap projects. If not, create a projects directory somewhere, and let's go there. OK, so for the workshop, we're going to create a new project. Do you have the still installing? OK. Well, why don't I take the opportunity then? I want to make sure that you can follow along. Let me quickly explain the difference between the Phonegap CLI and the Cordova CLI. And before I do that, let me explain the difference between Phonegap and Cordova in general. And Brian will keep me honest. So about, I think, was it 2 years ago that Adobe acquired Nitobi?
Yeah.
OK, so Nitobi is the company that Brian worked for, and about 20, 30 other people. I don't
23.
know. 23 other people.
Yeah.
And so about 2 years ago, Adobe acquired that company. Now, Nitobi had plans to contribute Phonegap to Apache. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then when Adobe acquired Nitobi, I think the community was a little worried that maybe Adobe wanted to turn it into a proprietary platform and that kind of stuff. And Adobe immediately said, no, 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 we're going to go along. We're going to contribute Phonegap to the Apache Foundation. I think for IP reasons, it was not contributed as Phonegap because there was some IP issues associated to that, Brian?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to talk about it.
But
there was a litigation happening.
Yeah.
And Apache didn't want to inherit that litigation. And so Apache, and this is actually really normal for Apache, they want to have like a special name that's trademarkable that only the Apache Software Foundation can defend. And that was actually our first big mistake. We named it Callback.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Callback.
we did this big brainstorm, and we're like, what can we call this thing? And then we thought Callback, JavaScript makes sense. And then we started rewriting our docs, and it was really apparent that that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, so when you call the callback, oh shit. Yeah, so then there was a small revolt, and then we picked Cordova.
Good. You could have called it Promise, because people don't like callbacks anymore. They like to work with Promise. Anyway, so it became Cordova, but so Adobe owns the Phonegap brand, and so the plan that we announced was that we would contribute, and basically the Nitobi team would continue to build Cordova and to contribute to Cordova along with developers from Google, from Microsoft, from Nokia, from Mozilla, from Intel, IBM, Google. So we would continue to contribute to Cordova, but there would be an Adobe distribution under the name of Phonegap. Now, the key thing, so you can forget all I said because that's just the history. The key thing for you to understand is that it's exactly the same thing. In other words, there is no, when you download Phonegap, you are actually downloading Cordova, okay? So the bits of, at least of the framework, are the same. There is not really a different Phonegap packaging of the framework. So what we said was, okay, we are going to provide additional services on top of Cordova. And the first service that we actually announced about a year later, so about a year ago, was Phonegap Build. And the idea of Phonegap Build is that you're all Mac users here. How would you create a Windows Phone distribution? How would you package your application for Windows Phone? And the other way around, how do Windows developers package an application for iOS? Okay, so that creates you can use a virtual machine and that kind of thing, but it makes it very difficult. And now I'm just talking about two platforms, but you can see that if you had to build your application for 5 different platforms, what SDK do you need? What IDE comes with that SDK? It makes it extremely difficult. I can use Xcode, I can use Eclipse, but the other platforms, I don't even know what kind of SDK and what kind of IDE they want me to use. So the idea was to provide essentially a build server in the cloud, where you could point that build server to your code, and we'll do that actually in a minute. And that build server would actually create 6 or 7 different distributions of your app for all the different platforms. So Phonegap Build is essentially a build server in the cloud that's going to build your application for all the supported platforms. So that's a first service that Phonegap adds to Cordova. And if you want, it makes total sense, because a build server in the cloud, essentially a hosted service, wouldn't make sense in the context of an open source project, right? In the context of Apache, they are about open source software. They are not about hosted infrastructure. So it totally makes sense to have Phonegap Build under the Phonegap brand, because Apache wouldn't even consider something like that. It's not what they do. So now, let's speak specifically about the CLI. You know that in July, when we announced Phonegap 3, we kind of changed the way you create a project. And we came up with that great CLI that we will discuss in a second. And essentially, it creates a directory structure that will support different platforms and things like that. We'll go through that. And most of the Phonegap CLI is essentially the exact same thing as the Cordova CLI. It is the same thing. You can look at it this way. The Phonegap CLI is a kind of a wrapper around the Cordova CLI with a few additional features. And right now, really the only additional feature is that it supports Phonegap Build. So you can instruct the Phonegap CLI to go build your application in the cloud using the command line. You don't have to go through that, sometimes clunky web UI to actually build your application in the cloud. You can do it all through the command line. Okay, so you can build your application in the cloud through the command line. And that's really the only difference between the Cordova CLI and the Phonegap CLI. In other words, if you don't plan on using Phonegap Build, you may as well use the Cordova CLI because it's exactly the same thing. Make sense? Are you ready? Cool. OK, so we're going to create a project. And
can you move the terminal into the middle of the screen?
Sure. So we're going to create a project for the workshop. And you can call it whatever you want. I'll call it Lisbon. So I'm using the Phonegap CLI to do that. I'm going to open a Finder at the same time. And you will see here that right now, I don't have a project called Lisbon. But when I do this, you see that that folder was added with a specific directory structure. www is really where you will code your app. Plugins, we'll speak about that in a second. That's where plugins are going to be installed. Platforms is going to be a specific folder for, is going to contain a specific folder for each platform that you support. And I will speak about merges in a second. So you see that simply by doing Phonegap create Lisbon, that directory structure was actually created for me. So now I'm going to cd to Lisbon to be in my project directory. OK? And one thing I could do just for fun at this point without even looking at the code, because there is a simple skeleton application that has been created as part of this. But we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to build it. So I'm going to say Phonegap Build iOS. Now, before I press Enter, remember that right now I don't have anything under platforms. So I'm just going to do, yeah, if I spelled it right. OK. So you see that automatically the iOS folder was created. OK, and I'm done. And guess what you're going to find in the iOS folder? You are actually going to find an Xcode project in there, OK, that I could open and then run. OK, so in fact, why don't I just do it? All right, so here is the project. And I'm just going to run it right now in the simulator. And here we go. OK? Before you run it on your phone, obviously, you need to make sure that you sign it somehow. So you provide your developer certificate and an application provisioning profile. We'll see that in a second. But so you see that it's there. And at this point, you are all set. The only thing you have to do is really go in that www folder, and you start writing your app. And then you come back to Xcode, and you run it. Now, before going back to Xcode, obviously, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to do this again, right? Every single time you change your app, you need to rebuild it. Now, what is it doing exactly when you build for iOS? We saw that it created that, that project. But look, if I go under platforms, you will see that there is actually a www folder right in there. You see it? And in fact, for the most part, it's going to be a copy of this one, the one that's right under your project name. OK? With a few platform-specific changes. For instance, if you remember pre-3.0, one of the biggest problems that people had, 80% of the questions on Stack Overflow, hey, I included Phonegap.js, and when I invoke the camera, it doesn't work. But it works on Android, but it doesn't work on iOS. And you know what the problem was? They used the Phonegap.js, the Android version of Phonegap.js on Android, or the other way around. people didn't always realize that there was a Phonegap.js for each platform. Okay, so the Phonegap.js for Android was not the same as the Phonegap.js for iOS. And people didn't realize that, so they always used the same. Obviously, it was working fine on one platform, but it was not working on many other platforms. Okay, and that was difficult to manage. So right now, what you do, in fact, you can see that if you actually open at the root level, let's open under www, which is right under Lisbon, just open index.html in there with your favorite text editor. I'm going to use Sublime here.
Not brackets?
Well, yeah, I could use brackets. We'll use brackets for the rest of the workshop. Thank you, Brian. I can. Here we go. And there is really only one thing that I wanted to show you at this point. We'll go much deeper later. But see that script? It references Phonegap.js, and you notice that there is no path. In fact, please don't try to provide a path. You will also notice that in that folder, there is actually no Phonegap.js. So right under your project name, www, there is no Phonegap.js. So when you build, when it copies all your project under platforms, it's going to take care of that and place the right Phonegap.js under the platform-specific folder. Okay, so now if I go back under platforms, you will see that in there will be a Phonegap.js. Here it is, and obviously we made sure that it's the right Phonegap.js for, in this case, iOS. Does that make sense? So what we do when you build, and it's important to know that because otherwise you can sometimes get confused, most of what's in here gets copied under the platform-specific www, but we make the necessary adjustments for that specific platform. Another example of that, so Phonegap.js is a really good example of that. Imagine that for some reason, even though you would like to think that you can write once and deploy anywhere, imagine that for one specific part of your application, let's say you have a util.js and you have to do it completely differently for iOS and for Android. So in other words, you would like to use a different version of util.js for iOS and for Android. That's what the mergers directory is for. Okay, so I didn't speak about that one yet. But you see, under your projects, you have mergers, okay? And right now, we just have iOS in there because that's the only platform we build. You could, under iOS, create a new file called util.js or a specific image or logo of your platform or whatever. Any file that you put in here will override the version of the same file that is in the common www. So in other words, that's where you put platform-specific versions of specific files. Does that make sense? I will tell you, most of the time you don't need to do that. So this is not a very common thing to do, but if you, at some point, you know, maybe it can be a style sheet or something like that, because you want to use, obviously, and that would actually be a decent reason, a decent use case for that. If you had a different style sheet for Android and for iOS, a nice, elegant way of solving that problem would be to use the mergers directory. Make sense? Cool. All right, so let's go back to the command line here and do something like Phonegap Build Android. Okay, and watch your folders again. Now, this is going to fail on your machine if you don't have the Android SDK. Okay, So I happen to have the Android SDK installed on my machine, but it's going to fail if you don't have it. And by the way, it would have failed for iOS as well. If you don't have the iOS SDK, it's not going to compile it. It's not going to be able to compile it. Okay, so again, if I look under platforms now, you see that in addition to iOS, I now have Android as well. So I have two different versions of my application. Again, it is mostly the same application that's in there with, a few different things. Like, for instance, I would have the specific Android version of Phonegap.js in there. OK, so what do you do? Well, so how many people have actually the Android SDK?
I have it installed, but I need to log in to the build.phonegap.
Right. So if you don't have the SDK, it's going to try to go build it in the cloud for you. Now, if you have it and it thinks you don't have it, it's because it's not in your path. And there are two things that need to be in your path from the Android SDK: the tools directory under Android and platform tools. So these two things need to be in your path. If they are not, then we're not going to be able to build, and we're going to go try to build it in the cloud for you. Well, you have to go add it yourself.
Yeah, you can add it to your path. And, and the good news is they change where those tools are every release of Android. So that's cool.
Yeah, and I mean, you can also change it yourself. So, I mean, I put it under my user directory.
Here's
there.
mine. So, I don't know, can you see that? I have my Android SDK in a thing called repo, and then I'm just adding it to my path there. Yeah, it's a pain.
Yeah, but don't worry. I mean, you know, the goal is not to get it, because in fact, it's a good exercise to go build it in the cloud. Now, to go build it in the cloud, you need a Phonegap Build account. How many of you have a Phonegap Build account? Just 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to wait a little longer. No? OK, so if you don't, you go to build.phonegap.com.
It wouldn't work with my GitHub. I had to sign up with an Adobe.
It wouldn't work with your GitHub?
Really?
You have to. Oh, OK.
Like, I did the authorization, and then I tried to build it.
And it still didn't work?
No, and then I signed up with my Adobe one, and it worked.
And that worked?
So maybe I did something wrong.
OK.
Wow.
That's how they get you.
So if you don't have one, go on build.phonegap.com and sign up for the service. I'm not trying to sell you anything here. It is free for open source projects, and it's even free. You have one non-open source project that you can build. So let me make sure. I mean, I'm not like a marketing person, but I know that it's free. So it's free for open source projects. How, you know, there are a lot of companies that try to do that, but the question is always, you know, what is an open source? You know, how do you define an open source project? So we simplified it pretty dramatically. If it's on GitHub, we consider it open source. Okay, so in other words, if we can go pull it from a GitHub repo, you can build it for free. If we can't pull it from a GitHub repo, then you can build one. But if you want to build more than one, we have some paying options that I'm not going to cover in this workshop because it's obviously not. But just know that you can do it. Okay? All right. So I do have the Android SDK, but imagine that I don't have it. So I can force my project to be built in the cloud. So let's take a quick look. If I go to build.phonegap.com. Oh, OK. I don't have an internet connection. I'm using my own. OK. So I'm not going to show it. Ooh, that's going to be, yeah. OK. Well, I'm just going to pretend you're going to do it. Of course, the prerequisite is to have an internet connection. You do something like this. you say Phonegap remote build Android. Okay? Now, if you do that, then it's going to go build it in the cloud. And after that, you can go back to build.phonegap.com, and you will see your application there. Okay? The nice thing is that you didn't have to, go through the web UI. It's just there. Okay? So what's going to happen when you do that? It's going to zip up whatever is under platforms Android. Okay? It's going to upload it to Phonegap Build. It's going to build it. And then it's there. And at that point, you can do a few things. You can download the APK. You can use a QR code and install it directly from your phone using the QR code. Or you can even do something a lot more fun. Like this, you could do Phonegap remote install. It's a pain that I can't show it to you without an internet connection, but I hope you guys will see it. If you do Phonegap remote install Android, it's going to give you a nice ASCII version of the QR code in terminal that you will be able to actually scan with a QR code, and it should install your application. So that is actually pretty fun. Okay.
Try your Wi-Fi again, maybe?
Well, the thing is, I'm using my own router to be able to stream. Okay. But you guys can try it. Anybody tried it?
Awesome.
Yeah.
See that? When low tech meets high tech, yeah.
It's kind of cool. It's not a real development workflow.
But
when we figured out we could put a QR code in the terminal, we had to do it.
yeah. Exactly.
Oh, I just lost my internet. I think we're making Sapo mad.
Yeah. All right. So you see the difference between building locally. Of course, if you have the SDKs and all that, it's going to be a much faster workflow. But for the platforms you're not familiar with, you don't have the right SDK, the right IDE, it's really cool to be able to build in the cloud.
There's kind of another point to it too. There's a open source. The CLI is open source, and it's built on top of some other libraries, which are also open source. So the CLI uses a library called Phonegap Build, which is a RESTful kind of binding back to the Phonegap Build service. A lot of people use Phonegap Build just for CI systems, so they'll just run constant builds on Phonegap Build, and they'll pull those binaries down at will, and they'll know if they have a build or not. It's better than running on your own personal machine. It was kind of one of our original use cases, actually, for Phonegap Build. Then we found it was actually useful outside of that.
Yep. Good point. And so this is exactly the difference between the Phonegap CLI and the Cordova CLI. The Cordova CLI doesn't have remote. Okay? So if you don't need remote, you can use the Cordova CLI.
One other thing about the Cordova CLI is it's a completely different interface. We made it really low level so that we can build a higher level abstraction on top of it with Phonegap. And there's a lot of other distributions of Cordova. IBM has one called
Worklight, yeah.
Salesforce has a distribution, SAP has a distribution, and those guys all have completely different use cases. So by virtue of that, Cordova is kind of low level and very verbose, and Phonegap is more high level and targeted for app developers directly. So if you start doing stuff inside of Cordova and it doesn't work, just run the help.
Yeah.
It does all the same things, it just takes longer to do.
Now, a big difference between 3.0 and the previous versions is that we wanted a very lightweight core version of Phonegap. So, in 2.x, we had a bunch of core plugins installed by default, and people started to tell us, well, why do I have to, carry the weight of the camera plugin and the geolocation plugin if my application actually doesn't use them. Okay, and if you add them up, it's some weight that maybe you didn't want in your application. So in Trio, we kind of changed the way we really package Phonegap. By default, you have nothing. You don't have any of the core plugins. If you didn't know, everything in Phonegap is really implemented as a plugin. So geolocation, contacts, compass, all these things, file, camera, everything is a plugin. By default, with Phonegap 3, none of them are installed. So that's the number one thing now that you always have to. I still sometimes get caught by surprise. Hey, my camera is, I forgot to install the camera plugin. Okay, so how do you install a plugin? You will do Phonegap local install, Phonegap local plugin install, and then a Git repository where the plugin is available. Now, that information is not always easy to find, so you can go on my GitHub page. So, and
it should be in our docs.
Or it should be in your docs, but you'll see that it's. So what I did there, and maybe I can switch now. Let me quickly switch.
The new docs.
Yeah.
But it won't say Phonegap. It'll say Cordova plugin.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have to go. So yeah. So obviously it's in the docs, but it's kind of not super easy to. Well, you have to go through all the different plugins and grab the URLs. So you can do that. Or let me try to switch my Wi-Fi here and see.
There's another new way too, and that's if you do have internet, you can go to plugins.cordova.io.
Yeah.
And this is brand new. So keeping that in mind, you can install by package name. We've forked npm, and we have our own downstream of it, where we're using it for plugins installation and removal and discovery. And the one thing we didn't like about npm, and Isaac and I have argued about this, is npm doesn't have namespaces, so it's effectively a very large land grab, and you've got a lot of projects inside of npm called like capybara or whatever, like completely meaningless shit basically. And we wanted to have our plugins be really strictly namespaced and discoverable and easy to understand the package owner and name and place that it belongs to. So most of the packages right now are org, Apache, Cordova. Soon you're going to see com, Adobe, Phonegap plugins, and you're also going to see com, Google plugins for Chrome packages, which I think there's some in there now.
So if you want, for this workshop, a quick cheat sheet, you can go and you're going to have to download. So this is my repository on GitHub that we're going to use for this workshop. So my last name, that's the hard part. And then Phonegap Day EU. And in the README, so you can download or clone that thing. And
nice.
I have a cheat sheet with kind of, if you want to quickly grab the plugins. This is really all the core plugins, but I always go there because it's just easy. And so imagine now that I want to install the camera plugin. I would just grab this guy here, Command C, and I go back to terminal, and I would just paste it there. And you basically grab the plugins that you need, and you install them. OK, so it's going to pull that from the network, of course. And it's done. And now if you go look at your project folder, under plugins, you will see that, hey, I just installed the camera plugin. OK? Now, some of the plugins, you wouldn't think you need to install a plugin for that. So I want to quickly go through the list here. Some of them are pretty obvious. So device, I think it's a good idea to always install it. It's going to give you the basic information about the device. Battery status is self-explaining. Geolocation as well. Device motion, device orientation, camera, media capture. Okay, console is one that you may not think you need. So if you want to print to the console, so do console.log and then something and actually see it in the Xcode logs, you need to install the console plugin. So that one I recommend you always install, at least during development. Network information, file and file transfer. Splash screen is actually a plugin. So you need to install that. If you want to be able to have the native navigator.alert kind of thing as opposed to the, default JavaScript alert, you need to install the dialogues plugin. And we'll speak about that later. And I think the other ones are pretty obvious. So at least that's what I do. I always install console and device, and then depending on the application and what I need, I will install additional ones. So you can actually do that for your projects. Please install device, console. You will probably need dialogues as well. So if you want to grab these 3 plugins and install them, that would be cool.
Is the console plugin actually packaged into the build version, or is it used just in development?
Yeah, it's packaged in the build version.
Yeah.
But you can plug in, remove at the end if you wanted to. When we built the console plugin, all we do is pipe to standard out, which is not something browser consoles do.
Yeah.
So it kind of just falls off the map. It doesn't do anything unless someone had like a Android debug bridge plugged in or something.
Yep.
Also found the GitHub repo Phonegap/Phonegap-plugins.
Yeah.
Is that
The GitHub, yeah. So those are pre-Trio.
Yeah, those are the old ones.
Yep.
So the plugins thing is a story of pain and embarrassment. So we didn't, first of all, acknowledge we had plugins. At the very beginning, we built Phonegap as a plugin-based architecture, and we got really excited, and we started implementing shitloads of our own plugins. And then we were like, whoa, 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 this is a bad idea. We're adding way too much to this thing. We should abstract out the plugins and create like a common interface for people to use. Unfortunately, people started to find that we were going in that direction. They started to create their own community plugins. And we sort of were in denial about it. We're like, hey, these are undocumented, don't do that. But in an open source project, you're never actually truly undocumented, and nothing's truly private. And so people created these plugins, and we thought, well, let's give them one place to do it so it's easy to discover. This was also a big mistake. So the plugins inside of that repo may or may not work with any given version of Phonegap. They're not installable programmatically. They don't follow a standard format. They're basically just sketchy code. So plugins post 3.0 use the plugin registry that I just showed you, plugins.cordova.io. They follow a standard format, and they're installable and removable because they follow a standard format. Yeah, so they're good for learning how to write native code and plugins, but I would kind of avoid them otherwise. And we're not going to get rid of them, we'll leave them there, but as a learning tool, our plan is to eventually port all of those plugins to the 3.0 structure. We just kind of haven't gotten around to it yet. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing. So my hope is one day that repo just becomes like historical obscurity and everyone just goes to plugins.cordova.io and uses that.
Yeah.
We're not quite there yet. This is all very brand new too. I mean, if you look, the plugins got updated 2 days ago on this registry. So you guys are actually the first people we've really talked to about this stuff.
Cool. So now it's time to really open an editor. As Brian mentioned, if you don't have a favorite code editor, Adobe has another open source project called Brackets, which is the tool that you see here on the screen. You can use that. It's very nice. It's simple. I mean, this is not the next Eclipse. It's not meant to be like that monster IDE that's going to do PHP, Java, C++, and everything else. It's really and it's really built for web apps, and it's really trying hard to stay very clean. You'll see that there is no tons of panels and stuff like that. The goal is really to let you focus on your code, and I think they do a pretty good job at that. So what we're going to do is we're going to open the folder, and obviously you don't have to use brackets for this project. You use whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm going to go open in my Lisbon directory. Remember, the files you should work on are those ones, okay? The www straight under your project name. You shouldn't go edit what's under platforms, because every time you'll do a build, it's going to override that, okay? So be very careful. Always edit the version that's right under your project name in that www folder. Okay, so I'm going to open that thing. Okay, and so that's the sample application, and I'll ask you to maybe modify it a little bit during this workshop. And before we do that, I wanted to quickly show you the application that we are actually going to build, or at least you will go through the steps. So let me quickly start it here. Okay, I'm going to try to stream it. Oh yeah, I need to go on that other network now, and I have to juggle a little bit here. All right, that should work. Here we go. Okay, so this is the application that we will work on. Simple, traditional application, hopefully quite clean and performant. We lose some of the performance through the streaming. So this is not the simulator. This is the actual screen of my iPhone. People always ask, so I'm using an application called Reflection that usually works nicely, depending on your network. So it's really fast. This is all native scrolling. So then you can select an item, the transitions. Hopefully we don't lose too much of that. Very smooth, hardware accelerated. We'll speak about that later. Again, you have the details here. You could take a picture of you and your shoes, for instance, to share with the community. So there are a couple of features like that. There is also the new type of Hamburger Menu, if you didn't know what we mean by that. So this is the menu sliding from the left there. So in my Hamburger Menu, I have some filters. So for instance, if I don't want to see the woman and maybe I just want to see the men's products, I can filter this way. I can do different things, and then I can close my menu like that. You can search for different products by name. So for instance, I'll do this. Okay, and so you can search, you can hide the search. So there are a couple of things that you can do. And this is the application that we will look at. We'll look at the architecture. You will probably build a piece of it. So before we discuss that, this may also be a good time to introduce a UI framework that we are using here to build this application. The UI framework is called Topcode. Anybody familiar with Topcode? You have seen it. Few people have seen it. let me quickly tell you what Topcoat is and how it, how we started working on that. So Topcoat is yet another open source project started by Adobe, but it's on GitHub too, so you're welcome to contribute to the project as well. About a year and a half ago, I was doing a lot of these things here, and we did workshops, and I spoke with developers. I looked at their application, and guess how these applications looked? They pretty much all looked ugly. And I think that historically, a lot of people have asked us, tell us what's the best stack to build a Phonegap application. Which UI framework should I use, or which framework should I use? And we really wanted to be agnostic, because the reality is we don't care. Whatever works for you is fine, right? If that stack works for you, that's fine. But we noticed that there wasn't a lot out there in terms of UI framework to make your applications look decent. And we are all developers. We know how to make it beautiful, inside beauty, but outside beauty. As developer, okay, we can all hack some CSS, but that doesn't mean that it's nice. Okay, there are other people who are really skilled who can really do that right. And so that became, I would think, that became really the biggest hurdle for Phonegap adoption, is that every time we demonstrated the Phonegap application, it really didn't look good. And so we figured we had to do something about that and try to help the community build applications that looked decent. And so we started that new project. Now, the last thing we wanted to do was to add yet another framework to the zoo of frameworks that's already out there between Backbone and Angular and Knockout and all these things. They are all good frameworks, and you didn't need another one. But these frameworks, they don't do anything in terms of UI. It's all about MVC architecture, that kind of thing. So we said, let's focus on that top layer, the UI layer, because on top of that, Adobe knows something about that, kind of UI experience stuff. That's kind of Adobe's DNA. So let's just do that. Not at all MVC, just the UI layer. And the best way to do it is to do it CSS only. So we don't interfere at all with your architecture. You can still, you can. All right. Yeah, no, that's cool. You can still use the architecture that you want. It's basically as easy as adding a CSS to your project. Now, of course, tweak the markup a little bit, and that's it. And you can use the framework that you want or no framework. So there is a website for Topcoat. It's topcoat.io. From there, you can go to the GitHub repo. They will link you to the GitHub repo, and you can download it from there. You can also contribute, because it's all on GitHub. You can do pull requests or a more formal contribution. You can get all that information right there. Okay, but the key point is it's 100% CSS at this point. Okay, so there is no JavaScript. And the other key point is that it was built with a performance-first approach. Most people, when they started with Phonegap, they went to jQuery Mobile, because that was kind of the only framework that provided these out-of-the-box, somewhat decent-looking components, right? But jQuery Mobile initially was not focused on apps. It was focused on mobile websites. Therefore, if you focus on mobile websites, now you have to support legacy browsers. And when you have to support legacy browsers, you don't take advantage of the latest features in modern browsers, like hardware acceleration and things like that. So historically, jQuery Mobile was not the fastest thing that you could get. And that was another issue with Phonegap apps in jQuery Mobile, is that they were not really performing very well. Now, there is no reason for a transition, a page transition, to be jerky if you use hardware acceleration. We'll speak about that. We'll speak about that later. But so, performance first. we have a whole suite of tests that we run every time we do a check-in to make sure that we don't lose on performance and things like that. So for us, that was really, really key as well. Brian is actually leading the project, so I don't know if you want to say something.
I wouldn't say leading, maybe coaching.
Or coaching, yeah.
Yeah, the performance first is the key thing, and so we said that at the very beginning. We're like, hey, what's the big problem we want to solve? The big, huge, hairy problem for Topcode was performance. None of these CSS frameworks had thought about it. And the other issue we saw, people were building Bootstrap-based apps, and they would like throw all this Bootstrap at their app, and they would only use it to style buttons. And that Bootstrap is a meg of CSS, and a meg of CSS on an older Android phone is a recipe for total failure. So we built Topcode in a modular fashion, but we wanted to be able to benchmark. How do you benchmark CSS? And when we started the project, it wasn't possible. And I talked to the Google guys about it, and Paul Irish was like, oh, there's this awesome undocumented API called telemetry. And so we snuck into the Chrome guts, and we pulled out telemetry data, and it allows us to measure mean time frame, load time, and layout time. So we started benchmarking on every commit, and we'd know if we made the app slower or faster on each component basis and with all the components. Google loved this stuff, and so now telemetry is going to surface inside of Chrome, and Mozilla is going to be adding an analog API. And there's now a grunt module out there, so you can run telemetry against your app and see if your app is getting faster or slower from a pixel painting perspective. So it's kind of a nice story. It's much better. Actually, if you look here, you can see like how dramatic stuff can be inside of Topcode. So like a check-ins, this is on a button, and right here we had a check-in where we accidentally added the copyright notice, and it got recursively added like 40,000 times. We would have never have known because it was slowed down like that unless we had this CI system to like point out that we're doing dumb things.
Cool.
Yeah.
So what I'd love you to do is actually download Topcode. You can get it from, I think, from topcode.io.
Yep.
And then you get a zip file that you just expand anywhere on your file system, and it's going to give you something like this with different folders.
So it's only for widgets, not for layout or shapes.
Yeah, right now there is no layout yet.
Because that's, of course, the difference between Android and iPhone. Like, where do you put things on the top or the bottom?
So layout is really solved,
Yeah.
and like there's tons of these frameworks, just like different grid systems all over the place, and almost all of those grid systems rely on floats. There are now emergent ones that are starting to target Flexbox and CSS grids, but those features aren't really well supported in all the browsers. And so we're taking a approach of solving this with patience. We're going to let people use the frameworks they're used to for layout. Layout in mobile is especially pretty easy because we're typically just dealing with lists of things, maybe a couple boxes of things when you get into more tablet form factors. Yeah, our dream is to actually use Flexbox, but because it's not quite ready yet, and we're not ready to do our own layout framework. Yeah.
Why did you choose stylus?
So that's a good question. So.
Yeah, I love it. I was very happy because, oh, stylus is not going to die.
So, well, don't get too happy. So Topcode, this is really actually important too. So Topcode is CSS, and we want people using CSS. We use Stylus to author Topcode because if you don't use a preprocessor and you're authoring CSS, then you're in for pain and suffering. So we liked, so there's less, and less is really popular because Bootstrap's popular, but less is actually not very well maintained. There's Sass and Compass, but those use Ruby, and we hate Ruby, so we're not using that. I'm just kidding, we don't hate Ruby, but we didn't want to add another dependency, and we knew JavaScript as a dependency is a pretty safe bet. And then there's Stylus from TJ Holloway-Chuck, who's, I'm pretty sure, a robot that doesn't sleep. I don't know how that guy ships so much code. We really like Stylus. We actually like his new project, Rework, a lot more. But Rework has some bugs, and we weren't able to fix them in time for us to just get churning on this. So we're using stylus. We plan to actually move over to rework at some point, but we don't really care. It's like that's the preprocessor. The deliverable is actually the CSS. Stylus also gave us another capability where we were able to use the mix-ins really effectively, so we could separate layout from reset from the aesthetic from platform. So if you want, you can just use button base in our resets. Or if you want, we can use our styling and theming. And our hope eventually is we'll be able to do targeted builds and use the merges folder inside of Phonegap where we can say iOS gets WebKit prefixes, but Firefox OS doesn't. So it's like super optimized builds. Yeah, that was kind of the reasoning there. So we didn't really pick it because we wanted it, but we just picked it because it was sort of like, I guess, the best choice. Yeah. That one got a lot of debate. There was a lot of people not stoked about it. But frameworks are hard.
Yeah. Cool. So when you unzip the topcode file, I want you to take these three folders, CSS, font, and IMG. I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to go in my project, Lisbon, and I'm going to paste that. Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to go. Oops, sorry. Yeah. I'm gonna CSS. Yeah, we can put it there. So we're gonna paste that under the www of the project, and it's fine to replace everything because remember that application is just kind of a skeleton, a sample app. Okay, and so now if you go back to your editor, you will see that in the CSS you had different themes. So Topcoat initially was started as a mobile framework, but we also have desktop profiles. And so that's why you'll see Topcoat Desktop and then Topcoat Mobile. And each version has two different themes, default themes. Obviously, you can use Stylus or you can add your own theme, but by default, it ships with a light theme and a dark theme. Okay? So now you can have fun a little bit with that. So first of all, I'm going to remove that copyright stuff. That takes too much room. And so you'll replace that default index.css that was part of the skeleton application. And you choose one. So I recommend you use the Topcoat Mobile Lite CSS. So Topcoat Mobile Lite. You can use, of course, the minified version if you want, or during development, it may be a good idea to use the unminified. Okay. So that's the style sheet. That's pretty much all you need. You can get rid of anything that's in the body here, because that was just the sample app. And then you can start building your app. And at first, it's a good idea to really use topcode.io as your guide. And I'm going to go back to the Wi-Fi. So go to topcode.io, and you can just cut and paste from there. So I'm going to guide you through it. as soon as I get network. So I think at the top, okay. So you go in demo at the top in top coat. All right. So make sure you choose the right theme. So remember, we are using top coat mobile light. So you choose that in the little selector here, the theme selector. Okay. And then usually in a mobile app, you need some kind of a navigation bar at the top, also known as the header. That is somewhere navigation bar here. Okay, so you see that's kind of the default. You can then click the Show Code Snippets, and you can actually grab that thing here to get you started. So this is really kind of the classes that top coat works with. You will notice, if you're familiar with it, that it uses BEM, which stands for, Brian?
Oh God, it's like block element modifier.
Something like that.
Yeah, block element modifier.
Right. And so basically, the key idea is to avoid, is to provide some kind of a namespacing to your classes, because otherwise, we always start quick and dirty with very short class names, and then we realize that, hey, we will bring in another CSS library that, guess what, use the exact same, large class name, and then everything, clashes. And so what BEM does, it has some logic here, essentially based on blocks of markup to provide a namespace for your CSS classes. So I'm just going to take that and go use that in my body here, okay? And you can indent that the right way if you want.
Body is in your index page.
That's right. That's right. This is just as an example here.
We are working on theming so that you can make your own top-coat themes and share them. And we're also working on making this process a lot better and easier. It's our hope that people would eventually, they'll modify package JSON in the top-coat top-level directory, and then they'll do their own custom builds with their own custom themes. And then eventually, well, another thing you get out of this is a living style guide. So when you download a top-coat, you've actually got this demo page locally on your machine.
Yes.
We were talking to a lot of different CSS developers, and they kind of recommend having these living style guides so developers just don't go and copy paste CSS and then change a couple things and then add more and more and more. The one quote that really stuck with me was from David Asher at Mozilla. It was like, developers are always going to copy and paste, so just give them something decent to copy and paste instead of like trying to pretend that they're not going to, because that's what we're going to do. So it's kind of the theory, and I think this workflow works, but if you guys feel this is clunky at all, like, please tell us, because we're working on trying to make it better.
Any specific decision by the fact of using the modular of BEM, the modularization versus the more normal ones, for example, from Bootstrap,
Yeah.
on object-oriented CSS and
Yeah.
the SMAC CSS.
There's a lot of debate over what's right and what's wrong and what's semantic and what isn't. We felt that this led to the most natural reading and obvious stuff. Some people feel that this isn't semantic. If you use top-coat dash button, for example, and you put it on a link, you make an anchor tag is all of a sudden a button. But maybe you don't want that to be a button. Maybe you want div tag to be a button. And there's good use cases for that when you have images and stuff. So I like them. We had to pick one. We picked it.
Exactly.
So it's
And
kind of
just
like
because I've never used this one, and I know this is not as used. I think
it's not as
the other
popular.
ones.
Yeah.
Just because.
Well, so one of the arguments that I liked for it is you get not only do you get this namespacing, but you get the scoping of what your elements are, and
You always know where you are.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Inside a module, a submodule, inside. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We've been in a few Hacker News flame wars on this one. And it's like there's many ways. This is one of them. It's okay. Yes, that's pretty much the best I can do to defend it. I like it, though. Actually, it's grown on me a lot. It is a little bit verbose, but that verbosity does make it a lot more clear what's the intent.
The other side is that you always know where you are. Right?
Yes. I think at first, I mean, that was my reaction too. I was like, oh my God, I mean, this is just too much stuff. But then after a while, you're like, okay, you just get used to it.
It's good that you didn't bind everything to the div side, so at least you can clean it up a little bit. Like you can make it a header.
If you want to, you can. Yeah, it's not. And actually, the Polymer guys have started hacking around with the top code, and it's translated really well to first-class elements themselves. So you can see a feature when the Shadow DOM is actually realized with web components that this is going to read really well because you're not going to have. You're going to have literally a top code navigation bar element as opposed to a div with a class.
Right after flex.
Yes, right after flex. Fingers crossed, man. This is all going to come eventually.
Yep.
Web is getting better.
All right, so when what's happened with my? So when you are done with that, you should see a simple header. Let's see, it's right here. So it should look like this. And from here, you basically use the same approach to start adding to it. If you need a list, you go back to top code in the style guide. You will find a markup, or at least the classes for a list. Here it is. And again, show snippets, and you can start that way.
The local server is actually Phonegap, or are you using?
Say that again?
The local server is more right.
Yeah, no, that is simply because I'm using brackets, and the preview mode of brackets goes through a built-in node server. But you can open it locally on your, with the file protocol, and that's going to work just fine as well.
There is a Cordova command that runs a static web server too. So you can do Cordova serve iOS, and it'll kick up a little web server for your iOS build.
Okay.
Which is another good little hack. You kind of want to have both Cordova and Phonegap installed at the same time so you can move between the two. Phonegap hides a lot of the dirty details, and as you get into development, eventually you're going to get dirty with those details.
All right, so there was a last thing that I wanted to cover before we dive into more of the architecture piece that I promised you, and that is remote debugging. So there are a couple of options available today. Historically, we integrated with Winery, which was kind of a remote, and is still a kind of a remote debugger. And we called it remote debugger, but what it really was mostly was a remote inspector, because you couldn't set breakpoints and that kind of stuff. So now, at least when you run on iOS, there are some really good options to do real remote debugging through Safari. How many people already do that, just to know if I should even cover it or not? How many people do remote debugging on the device? Just a couple of you. So let's how many people have an iOS device here? OK, that would be all except one. Sorry.
Android.
Nothing wrong with that.
Android. With you, man. It's cool. There's two of us.
But you may at some point have to debug on this device. So I'm going to, again, go back.
Do you know how to do it on Android? It's pretty easy.
Yeah, I've used ADB.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually a Chrome extension now that you can use.
Yeah, actually, you can activate remote debugging on Chrome.
Yeah.
OK, so I'm going to do this here. So first of all, if you have an iOS device, you're going to have to enable the web inspector. And so let me show you where that is. It is under Settings. And then you're going to find Safari in there. Oops. And I think it's the same thing if you're still on iOS 6. It's essentially the same thing. And then under Advanced, so Settings, Safari, Advanced, and you need to turn on the Web Inspector. OK, so that Web Inspector needs to be turned on. And then on your Mac, you need to enable the Develop menu item. So let me show you here. So if I go in the Preferences, so in Advanced, you have a checkbox there that says Show Develop Menu in Menu Bar. OK, and the only thing that that thing is actually going to do is enable this menu that wouldn't be there otherwise. OK, and now OK, so under Develop, you see that my iPhone is there, which is a good thing. But for some reason, let me try that again. I'm going to restart the app here. OK. Here we go. So you see that I have my device, that's me, and then anything that runs in a web view, including, in fact, Safari itself on the device, is actually debuggable this way. OK, so you may, in this case, I have a single application, but you may actually have different applications in there. OK, and so I'm simply going to select this one. And then I basically have, your traditional. So here I'm on the console. So you can run through your app here, and you see that it's going to show me. I'll be able to inspect the elements. I'm going to be able to even change stuff in there. So if I wanted to, change the value of something here, I'm going to test how long this can be. You see, and so if I bring back my my screen here, you see that I can go change the DOM here and see it right away, on the application, actually running on the device. You can actually set breakpoints in your code. So in this case, I'm in. OK, so here we go. So this is my router. OK, so I think that here, if I select an item, I should break. Here we go. I'm breaking here when I'm about to show the details. All right, and then I can go inspect all my objects in here, like you would always do.
It's so nice to have this
Yeah.
now.
So that makes a huge difference between this is really breakpoints. You can look at all your variables in there. You can change your variables. That is really, really cool.
We didn't have this until like a year and a bit ago.
Yep.
It was like flying blind.
That's exactly right. And before that, and to be honest, that's still what I do. I still spend most of my time in the browser, because that's the nice thing about building a web application, I use, most of the time I use Chrome, and the developer tools, I spend 80% of my time there, and then finally I will test on the device. So here you go. So you can do that, and you can do something similar for Android using ADB, and really step through your code this way. So very, very useful. All right. So that was really what I wanted to tell you in terms of the basic setup, how to create a project, really understand the directory structure when you use the CLI, and then the basic kind of infrastructure stuff, how to use topcode, how to run, build, and debug on device. So after this, we're going to shift gears and really start to focus on more of the architecture part of the presentation, unless you have specific questions regarding the first part, like really the plumbing, the Phonegap tools. At the end of the presentation, Brian is also going to give you a little bit of a roadmap for Phonegap and maybe topcode. But if you have other questions related to the tools as they exist today, it's a good time to ask. Otherwise, we'll just...
I don't have a question, but I'm seeing you're still on EST time zone there.
Yeah.
But,
Good morning.
so in half an hour, I didn't at the beginning in half an hour, so at 3 o'clock local time, we'll have a little coffee break. Okay?
My morning coffee break, right? That sounds great. OK, so let me go back to this. I'm gonna